Catus Maximus here again, this time with a review of more specialty wrenches and clamps. So these are an example of some of the more oddball type of vice grips. We do have a couple of non-Vise-Grip brand here, just as an additional example, like the Craig up there and then this vintage unit back here. But what this does is kind of exemplify one of the reasons Vise-Grip became such a name. It wasn't just because of their locking pliers, but to the fact that they saw the advantage of having the locking pliers in so many situations. One of the most common places is in welding and fabrication, because Vise-Grip makes these are just a couple, but they make a huge variety of various different types of clamps that are just a mainstay in welding and fabrication. Some of these clamps I've seen can be a foot and a half long. I mean, they would fill this picture frame. They're just these big old long Vise-Grip locking clamps. And so welding ones oftentimes are like this. They just have a couple of round points, no kind of swivels, and you just adjust them to hold a couple pieces of metal, or maybe this would be on the inside of an angle and then this would be on the outside of a plate, and you just use them and they lock it down and hold it while you're able to tack everything together. Many times you'll either be if you maybe seen in a welding fabrication shop or on TV on some kind of documentary or how it's made, you'll see welding jigs and they'll have just a whole array of locking pliers holding everything together, or I should say Vise-Grip locking clamps holding everything together. And it really was a big deal for them. I'm sure the sales were excellent, and they just had a huge variety of sizes, styles like this. They had styles like this, which had little swiveling flat feet, so these are a little bit better if you're trying to hold together wood or something like that, so it won't damage the surface quite as much. And that's exactly what I've used these for, is oftentimes when I'm gluing things or I just need to hold something together that's a little bit oddly shaped. These Craig's Vise-Grip has a version that looks just like these, so these are a similar situation, except for they just have wider swivel feet. These are actually extra wide, which is kind of nice if you're working with particularly soft materials, because it doesn't want to press in. But that's one of the deals, is that you can get all sorts of shaped different clamps. Other specialty Vise-Grips would be such as these right here, the RRs. These are, you really know, are unique because they actually have a lock nut to really prevent the adjustment from moving once you have it sized. These are actually known as tube crimp Vise-Grips, and they're very odd because when you look at a pair of Vise-Grips and you see these, they have this metal pin for the lower jaw, and then what looks like kind of like a cutting style upper jaw, but it's really rounded. It's not designed for cutting. And these really puzzle people the most because they think, well, is this for clamping on to pull out pipe? No, they're actually would be used, say, in HVAC, where you have copper tubing and you want to pinch off a tube and then saw it and then solder it. Say after recharging an air conditioning system, these would be exactly the type of Vise-Grips that you might use, and really the type of tool that you might use, because they clamp. The lock nut is to make sure that you get them adjusted exactly how you want, and then they won't move around at all. Because it can be, and you need that kind of sensitivity, because if you over clamp, you risk kind of pinching the tube off and actually breaking it, and not enough clamping force, and you won't actually seal it. And so these have actually been pretty handy for me. Only a couple times using copper tubing, but quite often, to tell you the truth, I've used them on small automotive applications. And say if I'm replacing a brake line that still has brake fluid in it, it's really nice because if I'm replacing the brake line, I'll go near each end and I'll just use these to crimp the brake line pretty hard, and it'll be enough to prevent the fluid from leaking out when I remove the banjo bowl and actually remove the brake line. So these have been pretty cool. And just to show you that there are tubing crimp Vise-Grips. Another style of Vise-Grips we have are these nut busters, and I have the little 4-inch and I have the larger 7-inch, and they make 10-inch versions of these. As far as nut busting tools, rounded nut, or any kind of like 5 or odd shaped nut, these things are pretty amazing. With these, you're usually able to clamp hard enough to where even if the nut is totally rounded off, it'll kind of regenerate its own flats. And this little hump here will create its own divot, and you're able to remove the nut. The only issue, obviously, is they're incredibly bulky, so they don't really fit in many situations. But when you can use them, they are just absolutely invaluable. And how they would work is you just put it on there and then adjust it down till the handle is close. And when you, that's probably a little too much. And when you lock them down, it's just amazing. You can see that it's a Vise-Grip. The way it wedges the two flats right into that top jaw, if this camera would focus, there we go. And you can see that always it sits right in the middle. And to tell you the truth, the times I have used this on rusty fasteners or stubborn nuts and I've been able to get access with it, it's worked every single time. The only real issue that I've had is sometimes on smaller nuts, if you have to balance how tight you clamp it down, because it's pretty easy to use it to crush a nut. But another distinct advantage is you can use it to upset a nut to turn it into a friction type lock nut that doesn't unscrew itself if it starts to get a little bit loose. So that's another distinct advantage to it. But when they came out with these things, I was always amazed because I thought, wow, that's incredibly handy. There's a few situations where you need to run a bolt in and out, say it's on a long threaded rod, and versus, you know, the through sockets, you know, I've reviewed Harbor Freight versions of those, or ratcheting external open end wrenches, which I've also done reviews on. The thing about these is that they lock onto the fastener and instantly becomes a handle. So if you have any kind of a bolt that you need to kind of run in and out to make an adjustment, they're just totally invaluable. They're locked on, and now you have a fixed heavy-duty handle on the end of that bolt, and can really make life a lot easier. So I highly recommend these, but these would be more, I would say, in a future collection, I wouldn't start off with these type of pliers because they end up having a bit of a limited application many times. What is kind of nice is they're traditional, so you still include wire cutters in the base, and they do have little jaws, so you can actually use them as a standard pair of Vise-Grips if you want to. These oddball ones up here actually are a locking type of clamp, and this would be an example of a design kind of, I don't think it would be before Vise-Grip, but an alternate to Vise-Grip when they had the patent, and they work pretty well. And it's just to show that there have been some attempts to essentially get around what Vise-Grip's design is, and it really never works, although these are okay. These have two legs that you adjust in and out, and then when you lock them, and I should make that a little bit tighter, these go over center, so what ends up happening is you can see the alignment of these three bolts, and when you lock them, this inner bolt goes in a little bit and actually hits a stop there. So these are a style of locking clamps. But instead of the adjustment being in the handle, you adjust it right through the anvils themselves. Of course, the disadvantage to these is when you're working on a large size, you have these posts that are sticking way out beyond the jaws, and that's one reason this style never really caught on. They're actually kind of hard to find. I've only ever seen a few pairs of this style, mainly because they're just so inconvenient, especially when these posts stick out. And unfortunately, I just can't really make out the name of who made these, but they are kind of interesting. They are forged. They're pretty heavy duty, but they just don't work out like a standard pair of Vise-Grip clamps. Now, of course, the last thing that we have here is the Vise-Grip chain wrenches, and I've done reviews on some chain wrenches before, but the Vise-Grip ones are, of course, locking, and you have all that leverage, so you can wrap this chain around and then get a huge amount of locking force on it. And this has, of course, been invaluable in many situations where I need to untwist or unscrew large diameter objects such as metal pipe, even PVC pipe that's threaded. In those kind of situations, you just, once again, have to be careful balancing grip with the amount of tightening force. Many times you'll need to use a piece of rubber or something on the inside of the chain to give it extra grip, because all you'll do is crush the object if you try to get the chain tight enough. But they are invaluable, and we do have a very old vintage unit here, and then we have a newer unit, and you really know the vintage one because it still has all the patent numbers and everything they had applied for. And to do a quick example of what one of these is they're very simple. You just take whatever object you're trying to clamp onto, get the chain in there, and sometimes it is a little funky. There we go. They can be a little clunky. Really, the big deal about these is you really have to open them up pretty wide. That way you can actually get the chain wrapped around the object tightly enough. You kind of fold over the back hook here until you can get it close enough to get it to want to engage in the jaws. And then you would tension it down to give it some base tension with the screw. There we go. And that's always kind of been the issue with these chain vice grips, is that you have to fiddle with them because you have to undo the screw a lot, get the chain wrapped around, and then run the screw back in so it's tight, and then you'll be able to actually use the vice grip action. But and I'm using a piece of or a roll of tape just to show, but when you use these, they'll get all the pressure you want. And like on this roll of tape, it'll just crush it and squeeze it out right there at the jaws because it's the only direction where it can get squozen out. And these things have been just absolutely invaluable in those situations. Fortunately, when you open them up, they basically fall off, so that is nice. They're just a little bit fidgety when you're trying to get them attached. But vice grip chain wrenches I've always really enjoyed because there's the situations where you use them, they're pretty much the only tool available that will actually work in a particular situation. And a nice aspect is you don't have the serrated jaws that are digging in while just using the chain to kind of leverage off of. Instead, this is relying entirely on the friction of the chain, and you have to be a little bit aware of that. They do nicely proportion, or I should say are pretty proportionate for the strength and size of the chain for, say, the 10-inch. But you do still have to be careful, particularly right where it's attached to the jaw. A lot of times what will happen is you'll be using these and you'll pull them sideways, and that's really the weak link. And I have seen a few broken pairs, and that's exactly where they have failed, is right here. Usually these plates, one of the plates just breaks and then it falls off. Fortunately, it's actually not too bad to fix them because you just... at least for me the last time was you just grind out the remainder of the rivet, punch out one of the pins, and then just reattach it using like a little hex fastener. Anyway, that was the end of this quick little review and overview of more specialty vice grip, especially clamps and wrenches. I really appreciate everyone watching. Please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.